Welcome to Walking to Maturity. I'm Uncle John. We're restarting today after a break of a couple of months. So this is the Tuesday edition of 5-Minute Biblical Insights. And we're continuing with the series that we started, which is Hebrews Demystified. And today is series 301, episode 12, and I've titled it The Believer's Rest. So what we're going to be doing is looking at Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 18 to 19, and in chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. We're going to be speaking about three things today. First of all, that God rested, a rest for the children of Israel, and then the believer's rest. So first of all, let's think about God resting. In Hebrews 4 and verse 4, we read, "On the seventh day God rested from all his works." Now, that wasn't because he was tired. I mean, he'd done a tremendous creation in those 6 days, and he rested. But that rest was something that's obviously something very special. And we need to think just about what that is, and whether the believer can actually enter that same rest, as I said, that God rested in. So God rested from all his works. Then the second thing we want to consider are the children of Israel and their rest. Their rest was into the promised land. So God promised them a land literally flowing with milk and honey. The ground was going to be very fertile. There would be lots of water, and it would be easy for them to grow their crops. In other words, they wouldn't have to work so hard, so it would literally be a place of rest. And that was the promised land. That was their rest. And we see in Hebrews 3 and verse 11 that God says, "They shall never enter my rest." So they left Egypt. They wandered around in the desert for 40 years, and eventually only those that were 20 years and under actually entered the promised land. The rest died in the wilderness. So God promised them a promised land, this wonderful land, but then he said they will not be entering it. And in verse 18 of chapter 3, "And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed?" So it was those that disobeyed that didn't enter. And in verse 19, so we see that they were not able to enter in because of their unbelief. So it was those two things, the disobedience and the unbelief, that stopped them from actually going into the promised land. And then in Hebrews 4 and verse 2, "For we also have had the good news salvation proclaimed to us just as they did, the children of Israel. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." So they had this wonderful promise of this promised land, the rest that they were going to enter into, but it was of absolutely no value for them. It's like being given a car, and you don't have the keys, you can't drive it. It just sits there. It's of no value to you whatsoever. So that promised land was of no value to them, because those over 20 years old didn't enter, and they didn't share it because they didn't share the faith of those who obeyed. Remember, there were only a couple of people that actually did obey God. Now I want to talk about the believer's rest. And the believer's rest, what is it? It's the assurance of salvation resulting from total reliance on God's grace. So we're totally 100% sure that we are saved. We're going to spend eternity with God. And so it's reliance on his grace and on his forgiveness. We have been forgiven for our sins. In fact, even the sins that we're going to commit in the future, because Jesus has already paid the price for everything. And in Hebrews 4 and verse 3, "Now we who have believed enter that rest." And the Amplified says, "We now have his inner peace because we are confident in our salvation and assured of his power." So we have that inner peace if we have believed. And I remember somebody asking me once, "How do you know that you're saved?" And I just had to say, "Well, I know that I know." And it wasn't a very satisfactory answer to them, but it was the best that I could do. And in verse 10 of chapter 4, "For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his." So in other words, we're no longer trying to please God and do this and do that, because we simply and only relying on the grace and the forgiveness of God and nothing else. So in verse 11, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest." So let's rest content in the rest that God has actually given us, and not try to earn our way into heaven and to earn points with God. And finally, I'm to speak about the early days when my wife Jenny and myself first came to know Christ. We originally came to know Christ when we were both about 8 or 9 years old. And but as adults, that adult decision, we found that the message was very confused by the people that were preaching reliance on works and not faith alone. And it ended up being a very confusing message. There were so many you must not rules. You must attend church, you must read the Bible, tithe, avoid worldly pleasures, for example, the cinema. What was the result? It took us a long time to enter into God's rest. From memory, I don't know, maybe something like a year, I can't really remember. So let's enter the rest of God and be content, and as we simply rely on His grace and forgiveness. So God bless you, and see you next week.